In the frozen mountains of Colorado, a widowed rancher stands at the train station clutching letters from a woman he's never met, his mail-order bride who promised to cross half the country to marry him. But when the stagecoach finally arrives, she's not on it. The driver says nothing. The town laughs. And 3 weeks later, word comes that her coach crashed in the worst blizzard the territory has seen in decades. Everyone assumes she's dead. Everyone except Silas Boone, who saddles his horse and rides straight into the killing winter to find a woman whose voice he knows only through ink and paper. This is the story of a search that should have been a funeral, a bride who refused to freeze, and a love forged in ice and blood. Stay until the end, and if this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this tale travels. The stagecoach was late. Silas Boone stood outside the depot in Silver Ridge with his hat pulled low and his coat buttoned tight against the wind. February in the Colorado high country was a mean season, the kind that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground and made every breath feel like swallowing knives. He'd been standing there for 2 hours, watching the road that carved through the valley like a scar. People passed him on the boardwalk. Some nodded. Most didn't. Silas wasn't the kind of man folks went out of their way to greet. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been carved with a dull blade, hard angles, a jaw that didn't smile much, eyes the color of winter sky. He'd lived alone on his ranch for 3 years, ever since his wife died bringing their stillborn son into the world. The loss had turned him quiet, distant, the kind of quiet that made people uncomfortable. But today, Silas wasn't thinking about the past. He was thinking about the future, about the woman whose letters were folded in his coat pocket, soft from being read too many times. Vivian Hale, a seamstress from Boston who'd answered his advertisement in the Matrimonial Gazette 6 months ago. He hadn't expected much when he'd placed that ad. A widower with a failing ranch and a reputation for being about as warm as a January creek wasn't exactly a prize. But Vivian had written back, and then she'd written again, and again. Her letters were careful at first, polite and measured, the kind of thing you'd expect from a woman making a business arrangement. But as the months passed, something shifted. She started asking questions that weren't about the ranch or the weather. She wanted to know what he thought about, what made him laugh, whether he missed the sound of another person's voice in the house. Silas had answered every question honestly, even the ones that made him feel exposed. He told her about the silence that had settled over his life like snow over a grave. He told her he wasn't looking for romance or poetry. He was looking for a partner, someone steady, someone who wouldn't expect him to be something he wasn't. And Vivian had written back and said she understood. She said she wasn't expecting a fairy tale either. She was 31 years old, unmarried, working 16-hour days in a dress shop for a woman who treated her like furniture. She wanted a life that was hers, a place where her work mattered, a man who wouldn't lie to her. In her last letter, she'd written, "I'll be on the February 14th coach. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I'm not afraid of winter. I'll see you soon, Silas." That letter had arrived 3 weeks ago. Silas had read it so many times the creases were starting to tear. Now the wind picked up, carrying the smell of snow and pine. Silas pulled his pocket watch from his vest. Nearly 4 in the afternoon. The stage should have been here by noon. Behind him, the depot door swung open. Frank Caraway, the station manager, stepped out onto the platform. He was a short man with a belly that strained his suspenders and a mustache that looked like a dead caterpillar. He glanced at Silas, then looked away. "Still waiting, Boone?" Silas didn't answer. Frank sighed. "Stage is late. Could be weather. Could be a wheel. Could be anything. Or it could be here soon. Could be." Frank pulled a cigar from his pocket and lit it, cupping his hands against the wind. "You really gonna marry some woman you never met, sight unseen?" "That's the plan." "Hell of a gamble." "Life's a gamble," Frank smirked. "Yeah, well, some bets are worse than others." Silas turned his head slowly, fixing Frank with a look that made the smaller man take a step back. "You got something to say, Frank?" "No, sir. Just making conversation." "Then don't." Frank muttered something under his breath and went back inside, leaving Silas alone on the platform. The wind howled through the valley, rattling the wooden signs and sending loose snow skittering across the frozen ground. Silas waited. An hour later, the sun began to sink behind the peaks, turning the sky the color of a bruise. Still no stage. Silas's fingers were numb inside his gloves, and his boots felt like blocks of ice. He was about to head inside to warm up when he heard it, the distant sound of hoofbeats and rattling wheels. The stagecoach came around the bend fast, too fast. The horses lathered and wild-eyed. The driver hauled on the reins, bringing the team to a skidding stop in front of the depot. He was an older man, grizzled and weathered, with a face like cracked leather. He didn't look at Silas, didn't say a word, just climbed down from the box and started unhitching the horses. Silas stepped forward. "You got a passenger, Vivian Hale?" The driver paused, then shook his head. "No passengers, just mail." Silas felt something cold settle in his chest. "She was supposed to be on this coach." "Well, she ain't." "Was she on the previous run? Maybe she got delayed?" The driver's jaw tightened. "Look, mister, I don't know nothing about your woman. I got mail to deliver and horses to tend. You want answers? Go talk to the line office in Denver." He turned and started leading the horses toward the stable. Silas followed him. "I'm asking you a simple question. Was there a woman named Vivian Hale on any of your recent runs?" The driver stopped and turned around, his eyes hard. "I said, I don't know. Now back off before I make you back off." Silas took a step forward, his hands clenched. "I've been waiting here for hours. She wrote me. She said she'd be here." "Then maybe she changed her mind." The words hit Silas like a fist. He stood there, frozen, while the driver led the horses away. Around him the town was coming alive with evening lanterns, warm light spilling from windows and doorways. But Silas felt colder than he had all day. Frank Carraway appeared at his elbow, smelling like cigar smoke and whiskey. "Told you it was a gamble, Boone." Silas didn't respond. He turned and walked toward his horse, a big roan gelding tied at the hitching post. His hands were shaking as he untied the reins. Not from the cold, from something else, something that felt too much like humiliation. He rode home in the dark, the wind cutting through his coat like it wasn't even there. His ranch was 5 miles outside town, tucked into a narrow valley between two ridges. The house was small, just 2 rooms and a loft, but it was solid. Silas had built it himself when he'd first married. It had been full of hope back then. Now it was just empty. He dismounted in the yard and led the horse into the barn, moving through the motions automatically. Feed, water, brush down. He'd done it so many times he didn't have to think, and that was good because thinking hurt. When he finally went inside, the house was dark and cold. He didn't bother lighting a lamp, just sat down at the kitchen table and stared at nothing. Maybe Frank was right. Maybe she'd changed her mind. Maybe she'd gotten halfway across the country and realized she didn't want to marry a stranger. It wouldn't be the first time someone had lied in a letter. Hell, maybe none of it had been real. Maybe Vivian Hale didn't even exist. Silas pulled the letters from his coat and spread them on the table. There were 19 of them, all in the same careful handwriting. He picked up the most recent one and read it again by the dim light from the window. "I'm not afraid of hard work, and I'm not afraid of winter. I'll see you soon, Silas." He sat there for a long time, holding that letter. Then he folded it carefully, put it back with the others, and went to bed. But he didn't sleep. The next 3 weeks were the longest of Silas's life. He went into town twice, checking with Frank at the depot. No word. No passengers. No Vivian Hale. The town started to talk. Silas could feel it every time he walked down the street. The stares, the whispers, the barely concealed amusement. The fool rancher who'd gotten stood up by a mail-order bride who never existed. He stopped going into town. Instead, he threw himself into work. The ranch needed it. The fences were falling apart, the barn roof leaked, and half the stock had wandered off during the winter. He worked from dawn until dark, repairing what could be repaired and ignoring what couldn't. At night, he sat by the fire and tried not to think about letters or promises or the sound of a woman's voice he'd never heard. Then, on a gray morning in early March, a rider came up the valley. Silas was out by the corral, hammering a new post into the frozen ground, when he saw the man approaching. He straightened, wiping sweat from his face despite the cold, and watched the rider dismount. It was Tom Ridley, the deputy from Silver Ridge. A young man, barely 25, with a nervous energy that made him fidget even when he was standing still. "Morning, Silas." "Tom." The deputy glanced around like he was looking for an excuse not to be there. "Got some news. Thought you should hear it from me instead of in town." Silas set down his hammer. What kind of news? Tom shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Stage line sent word. There was a crash about 3 weeks back, up in the high country, near Fletcher's Pass. Bad blizzard came through. The coach went over a ridge. Silas felt his chest tighten. Vivian. They don't have a full manifest yet, but yeah? There was a woman from Boston on that run. Name matches what you told Frank. The world went very quiet. Silas could hear the wind in the pines, the creak of the fence, his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Where is she? Tom looked at the ground. Silas, the crash was 3 weeks ago. They only just found the wreckage yesterday when the snow started melting. There were no survivors. Where is she? They haven't brought anyone down yet. The pass is still mostly snowed in. Could be another week or two before. Silas turned and walked toward the barn. Tom followed him. Silas, wait. I know this is hard, but there's nothing you can do. The pass is dangerous as hell right now. The line office is sending a crew up when the weather clears, but Silas saddled his horse. Silas, listen to me. You can't go up there. It's suicide. Silas cinched the saddle tight, then went to the tack room and started loading supplies into his saddlebags. Rope, blankets, matches, dried meat, a tin of coffee. He moved with the calm, methodical efficiency of a man who'd made up his mind and wasn't going to be talked out of it. Tom grabbed his arm. Damn it, Boone, she's dead. You understand me? She's been dead for 3 weeks. Silas looked at him. His face was blank, but his eyes were something else entirely, something cold and final. Then I'll bring her home. He pulled his arm free, swung into the saddle, and rode north without looking back. The trail to Fletcher's Pass climbed through dense forest for the first 5 miles, following a creek that was still half frozen. Silas pushed the roan hard, harder than he should have, but the horse was strong and sure-footed. By midday, they'd reached the tree line. Above that, the world turned white and brutal. The pass was a narrow cut through the mountains, steep and treacherous even in good weather. In winter, it was a death trap. Avalanches, ice, winds that could knock a man off his horse and send him tumbling down a 1,000-foot drop. The stage line only ran it during the warmer months, but sometimes they got desperate. Sometimes they took risks. Sometimes people died. Silas followed the old wagon road as far as it went, then left it and started climbing. The snow was deep here, nearly up to the horse's chest in places. He had to dismount and lead the animal, breaking trail with his boots. His legs burned. His lungs ached. But he didn't stop. By late afternoon, he reached the ridge where the crash had happened. He could see the scars in the snow, the long gouges where the coach had slid, the broken trees, the debris scattered across the slope. He tied the horse to a sturdy pine and made his way down on foot, using a rope to keep from sliding. The stagecoach was at the bottom of a ravine, half buried in snow and ice. The front axle was snapped, the wheels shattered. One side of the coach had been crushed against a boulder, splintering the wood like kindling. Silas approached slowly, his heart hammering. The door was open. Inside, the seats were torn and blood-stained. There were no bodies. Silas stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. Then he started searching the wreckage, digging through snow and debris. He found luggage, broken harnesses, a shattered lantern. And then, wedged between 2 pieces of splintered wood, he found something that made his breath catch. A carpet bag. Brown leather with brass fittings, the kind a traveler might carry personal belongings in. He pulled it free and opened it. Inside were dresses, carefully folded, neatly packed. Beneath them, a sewing kit, needles, thread, scissors. At the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a bundle of letters tied with ribbon. Silas's letters. Every single one he'd sent her. She'd kept them all. He sat down in the snow, holding that carpet bag, and felt something break inside him. Not grief. Not yet. Something sharper. More desperate. She'd been here. She'd been real. And now she was gone. He stayed at the crash site until dark, searching for any sign of where the passengers might have gone. But the snow had covered everything. If there were tracks, they were long buried. If there were bodies, they were somewhere under 10 feet of ice. As the light faded, Silas made camp in a small hollow sheltered from the wind. He built a fire, more for the light than the warmth, and sat staring into the flames. Around him, the mountains loomed like tombstones, silent and indifferent. Vivian Hale had come all this way to marry him. She'd crossed half the country, left everything she knew, carried his letters with her like they mattered. And she'd died alone in the snow, probably scared, probably cold, probably wondering if anyone would even care enough to look for her. Silas fed another stick into the fire and made a decision. He wasn't leaving until he found her. The next morning, he started searching in a grid pattern, working outward from the crash site. The terrain was brutal. Steep ravines, sheer cliffs, dense stands of timber choked with deadfall. Every step was a fight. But Silas had spent his whole life in these mountains. He knew how to read the land, how to spot the subtle signs that most people missed. By midday, he found the first real clue. It was a coat. Women's, heavy wool, dark blue with bone buttons. It was frozen stiff, half buried in a drift near a narrow creek. Silas dug it out and examined it. The fabric was torn in places, stained with dirt and what might have been blood, but it was well made, expensive by frontier standards. He held it up to the light, and his chest tightened. She'd been here. She'd walked away from the crash. Silas started moving faster now, following the creek downstream. The snow was shallower here, and he could see faint depressions in the surface. Old tracks, mostly filled in, but visible if you knew what to look for. He followed them for half a mile, his pulse pounding, until he reached a place where the creek bent around a rocky outcrop. There, caught on a thorn bush, was a strip of torn fabric, green calico, the same fabric he'd seen in the carpet bag. She'd come this way. Silas kept moving. The trail led him through a maze of boulders and fallen timber, always descending, always following the water. At one point, he found the remains of a fire, just a circle of blackened stones and charred sticks, buried under snow. Someone had camped here, recently enough that the stones were still faintly warm when he dug them out. His hands were shaking as he knelt beside the fire pit. He wasn't sure if it was from cold or something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope. By the time the sun started to set, Silas had followed the trail for nearly 3 miles. He was exhausted, his legs cramping, his face numb from the wind. But he couldn't stop, not now, not when he was this close. The trail led him into a dense stand of spruce, dark and silent, the trees so thick they blocked out most of the remaining light. Silas pushed through, ducking under low branches, his breath coming in hard gasps. And then, suddenly, the trees opened up into a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a cabin. It was old. Ancient, really. The roof sagged, the walls were rotted, and one corner had collapsed entirely. But it was still standing, and through a gap in the broken door, Silas could see the faint glow of embers. He dismounted and approached slowly, every nerve in his body on high alert. The snow around the cabin was trampled, marked with the same faint tracks he'd been following. He reached the door and pushed it open. The interior was dark and cold, the air thick with smoke. In the corner, huddled beside a dying fire, was a shape wrapped in blankets. Silas's heart stopped. He crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees beside the figure. The blankets were torn and filthy, crusted with ice. He reached out with shaking hands and pulled them back. And there she was, Vivian Hale. She was skeletal. Her face was gray, her lips cracked and bleeding, her eyes sunken deep into her skull. Frostbite had blackened her fingers and toes. Her breathing was so shallow, he could barely see her chest moving, but she was alive. Silas felt something surge through him, relief, terror, rage, all of it hitting at once. He pulled off his gloves and pressed his hand to her face. Her skin was ice cold. "Vivian," he whispered. "Vivian, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered. Slowly, painfully, they opened. She stared at him for a long moment, her gaze unfocused and glassy. Then, in a voice so faint he almost missed it, she spoke. "Silas?" He nodded, unable to speak. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear. He leaned closer. "I didn't change my mind." And then her eyes closed again. Silas didn't waste time trying to wake her again. He could see she was slipping, her body shutting down from cold and starvation. He had maybe an hour, maybe less, before she crossed a line she wouldn't come back from. He rebuilt the fire first, feeding it with every piece of dry wood he could find in the cabin. Broken furniture, roof boards, anything that would burn. The flames caught and spread, throwing heat into the small space. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. but it was something. Then he turned his attention back to Vivian. The blankets she was wrapped in were useless, frozen solid in places. He peeled them away carefully, hating the way her body stayed curled in the same position, like she'd been locked in place. Underneath, her dress was torn and filthy, caked with dried blood and dirt. Her boots were gone. Her stockings were shredded. And her feet, Silas forced himself to look. Her toes were black. So were 3 of her fingers on her left hand. Frostbite. Deep frostbite. The kind that meant the tissue was already dead. He pulled his own coat off and wrapped it around her, then added his spare blanket from the saddlebag. She didn't react, didn't even shiver. That scared him more than anything else. Shivering meant the body was still fighting. This was surrender. "Don't you die on me," he said quietly, wrapping her tighter. "Not after you made it this far." He needed to get warmth into her core, fast. He'd seen men freeze to death before, knew the signs, the gray skin, the shallow breathing, the way the body just stopped trying. He also knew that warming someone too quickly could kill them just as dead as the cold. But he didn't have a choice. Silas pulled Vivian close, tucking her body against his chest. She was so light it terrified him, like holding a bundle of sticks wrapped in fabric. He sat with his back against the wall, feeding the fire with one hand while keeping her locked against him with the other. Heat from the flames began to fill the cabin, pushing back the brutal cold. But Vivian stayed frighteningly still. Outside, the wind picked up. Silas could hear it screaming through the trees, battering the cabin walls. Another storm rolling in. Of course, the mountains didn't care that he'd just found her, didn't care that she was barely alive. The mountains just kept trying to kill everything in them. He sat there for hours, listening to Vivian's breathing, willing it to stay steady. At some point, he realized he was talking to her. Low, quiet words he wasn't even sure made sense. "You're tougher than you look. Tougher than anyone I've ever met. 3 weeks out here alone. Most men wouldn't last 3 days. Her eyelids fluttered, but didn't open. "I got your letters," he continued. "All of them. You kept mine too. Found them in your bag at the crash site." Still nothing. "I'm sorry I wasn't there when the coach came in. I'm sorry you had to go through this alone." The fire crackled. Wind hammered the walls. "But I'm here now, and I'm getting you out of here. You hear me, Vivian? You're not dying in this cabin." Sometime past midnight, she stirred. Just a small movement, her hand twitching against his chest. Silas looked down and saw her eyes were open, staring at nothing. "Vivian?" Her lips moved. He bent closer. "Cold," she whispered. "I know. I'm trying to warm you up." "Hurts." "I know that too." She closed her eyes again, but this time her breathing deepened slightly. Not much, but enough to give him a shred of hope. By dawn, the storm had settled into a steady snowfall, the kind that could last for days. Silas knew he couldn't move her. Not yet. Not in this weather. She was too weak, and the trail back to the valley would kill her before they made it halfway. So he stayed. He spent the morning reinforcing the cabin as best he could. He patched the holes in the walls with pine boughs and mud. He cleared snow away from the door so it wouldn't block them in. He melted snow for water and tried to get Vivian to drink. She managed a few sips before turning her head away. "You need to drink," Silas said, pressing the tin cup to her lips again. She pushed it away weakly. "Can't." "Yes, you can. Come on." "Silas." Her voice was barely audible. "Stop." He pulled back, frustrated. "If you don't drink, you'll die." "Maybe I'm going to anyway." The words hit him like a punch. He set the cup down and looked at her. Really looked at her. Her face was still gray, her breathing labored. But there was something in her eyes now, something he recognized. Defeat. "You survived 3 weeks alone in these mountains," he said flatly. "You walked away from a stagecoach crash that should have killed you on impact. You made it through blizzards and cold that would have frozen most people solid. And now you're telling me you're giving up?" She didn't answer. "Bullshit." Her eyes flicked to his, a spark of something, anger maybe, breaking through the exhaustion. "You don't know what it was like," she said, her voice stronger now. "You don't know what I had to do to stay alive." "Then tell me." She looked away. "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me." For a long moment she was silent. Then slowly, she started talking. The crash had happened at night during the worst of the blizzard. Vivian had been asleep when the coach hit the ice and went over the ridge. She didn't remember much about the fall, just the sound of splintering wood and screaming horses and the world turning upside down. When she came to, she was trapped under a seat, her leg pinned, blood in her mouth. The driver was dead. So was the man who'd been sitting across from her, a salesman from Denver. The other passenger, an older woman, was unconscious and bleeding from her head. Vivian had tried to wake her, tried to pull her free, but the woman never opened her eyes. By morning, she was frozen solid. Vivian had spent hours digging herself out of the wreckage, using a broken piece of wood as a lever. When she finally crawled free, the blizzard was still raging. She couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The horses were gone. The driver's body was buried under snow, and she was alone. She'd salvaged what she could from the coach, her carpet bag, a blanket, a tin of crackers someone had left behind. Then she'd started walking. She didn't have a plan, didn't know where she was going. She just knew that staying with the wreckage meant freezing to death. I followed the creek, she said, her voice distant. I didn't know if it was the right choice, but it was going downhill, and I thought maybe it would lead somewhere with people. She'd walked for 2 days straight, stopping only when she physically couldn't take another step. She'd slept in snowdrifts, under fallen trees, anywhere that offered a scrap of shelter from the wind. She'd eaten the crackers slowly, rationing them, knowing they were all she had. When they ran out, she'd tried eating snow. It made her stomach cramp and her body colder, but at least it was something. On the third day, she'd found the first cabin. It was even more ruined than the one they were in now, just 3 walls and part of a roof. But it had a fireplace. She'd gathered wood and tried to start a fire using a flint she'd found in the driver's coat pocket. It had taken her hours. Her hands were so cold she could barely hold the flint, and her fingers were too numb to feel the sparks. But eventually, she'd gotten a flame. That fire had saved her life. She'd stayed in that cabin for 4 days, resting, trying to regain her strength. But the food was gone, and she knew if she stayed any longer she'd be too weak to move. So she'd kept going. I found 2 more cabins after that, Vivian said, both abandoned, both falling apart, but they had roofs, and I could make fires. How long were you out there before I found you? Silas asked. I don't know. I lost track of the days. 3 weeks. She stared at him. 3 weeks? Give or take. Vivian closed her eyes. I thought it had been longer, or shorter. I couldn't tell anymore. Silas fed another stick into the fire, watching the flames climb. Why didn't you stay at one of the cabins? Wait for someone to find you? Because no one was looking. The words were simple, honest, and they cut straight through him. I was looking, he said quietly. She opened her eyes and looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since he'd found her. Her gaze was sharp despite the exhaustion, like she was trying to decide if he was real or just another fever dream. You're Silas Boone. That's right. I thought... She stopped, her voice catching. I thought you'd think I'd changed my mind, that I'd never gotten on the coach, that I was just another woman who made promises she didn't keep. I thought that too, for about a day. And then? Then I got word about the crash, and I stopped thinking and started writing. Vivian's eyes filled with tears. She turned her head away, but not before Silas saw them spill over. I'm sorry, she whispered. For what? For being like this. Her voice broke. For being a burden. Silas felt anger flare in his chest. Not at her. At the situation. At the mountains. At every damn thing that had brought them to this moment. You're not a burden, he said, his voice harder than he intended. You're alive. That's all that matters. But look at me. She held up her left hand, the one with the blackened fingers. I'm falling apart. Even if we make it out of here, we'll deal with it. Silas, we'll deal with it, he repeated, louder this time. One thing at a time. Right now, we focus on keeping you alive. Everything else comes later. Vivian stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she nodded. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 brutal, endless days trapped in the cabin while the wind howled and the snow piled higher. Silas kept the fire burning. He melted snow for water. He rationed the dried meat from his saddlebag, giving most of it to Vivian even though she barely ate. On the second day, her fever spiked. She started shaking uncontrollably, her teeth chattering so hard Silas thought they'd break. He wrapped her in every blanket they had and held her close, trying to force his own body heat into her. She mumbled in her delirium, fragments of sentences that didn't make sense, names he didn't recognize, apologies for things he couldn't understand. At one point, she grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Don't leave me here," she said, her eyes wide and terrified. "I'm not going anywhere." "Promise." "I promise." She held his gaze for a long moment, then her grip loosened and she slipped back into unconsciousness. Silas didn't sleep that night. He sat with his back against the wall, watching her breathe, terrified that if he closed his eyes, she'd stop. By the third day, the fever broke. Vivian woke up clear-headed for the first time since he'd found her. She was still weak, barely able to sit up on her own, but the glazed look was gone from her eyes. "How long was I out?" she asked. "Day and a half. I had dreams, bad ones. You talked some. Didn't make much sense." She rubbed her face with her good hand, wincing at the effort. "What did I say?" "Nothing important." That was a lie. She'd said a lot of things. About her mother. About a man named Richard, who'd promised to marry her and then married her best friend instead. About working 16-hour days in a dress shop just to afford a room in a boarding house where the landlord stole food from the tenants. About feeling invisible, disposable. But Silas didn't repeat any of it. Those were her secrets, and she told them to the fever, not to him. Vivian looked around the cabin, taking in the patched walls and the dwindling pile of firewood. "We can't stay here much longer, can we?" "No." "How bad is it outside?" "Bad, but the storm's dying down. We'll leave tomorrow if you're strong enough." "I don't think I'll ever be strong enough." "You'll manage. You've managed this long." She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "I crawled here on my hands and knees, Silas. I can't even stand up." "Then I'll carry you." "For 5 miles? Through snow?" "If that's what it takes." Vivian stared at him, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something else. Something softer. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. "Because you came all this way to marry me. Seems like the least I can do is make sure you survive the trip." "That's not a reason." "It's reason enough." She shook her head. "You don't even know me. I know you kept my letters. I know you walked through hell to get here. I know you're stubborn as a mule and tougher than anyone's got a right to be." He paused. "That's enough for now." Vivian looked away, but not before he saw the way her jaw tightened, like she was fighting to keep herself together. They left at first light the next morning. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world buried under fresh snow. The sky was clear for the first time in days, a pale blue that hurt to look at. Silas packed what little they had, then helped Vivian outside. She couldn't walk. Her feet were too damaged, and her legs wouldn't hold her weight. Silas had expected this. He'd rigged a sling using rope and blankets, something he could wear on his back to carry her. It wasn't comfortable, but it would work. "This is ridiculous," Vivian said as he helped her into the sling. "You got a better idea?" "No, but..." "Then stop complaining." He adjusted the straps, making sure her weight was distributed evenly, then started walking. The first few steps were awkward. Vivian was lighter than she should have been, but she was still a full-grown woman, and carrying her plus his own gear made every step a fight. But Silas had hauled hay bales and fence posts and 100-pound sacks of grain for most of his life. He knew how to push through pain, how to ignore the burning in his shoulders and the ache in his legs, how to keep moving when his body screamed at him to stop. The trail back was worse than he remembered. The fresh snow had buried the path entirely, and Silas had to navigate by landmarks, a distinctive rock formation here, a dead tree there. He moved slowly, testing each step before committing his weight. One wrong move, one hidden drop, and they'd both go tumbling. Behind him, Vivian was silent. Too silent. Silas glanced back over his shoulder. "You still with me?" "Yes." "How are you holding up?" "I've been better." "We'll stop in an hour. Rest a bit." "I'm fine." "You're not fine, neither am I. We'll stop in an hour." She didn't argue. They made it 2 miles before Silas had to stop. His legs were shaking, and his shoulders felt like they were on fire. He found a fallen log and eased Vivian down onto it, then collapsed beside her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just sat there, breathing hard, staring at the endless white expanse stretching out before them. "I'm slowing you down," Vivian said finally. "We're not in a race. If you left me here, you could move faster. Get help." Silas turned to look at her. We've been over this. I'm serious. I'm not leaving you. Silas, I said I'm not leaving you. His voice was sharp enough that she flinched. He took a breath, forcing himself to calm down. I made you a promise. Back in that cabin, you remember? She nodded slowly. Then stop asking me to break it. Vivian looked down at her hands. The fingers on her left hand were worse now, the blackness spreading past the first knuckle. She stared at them for a moment, then tucked them into her lap like she couldn't stand to look anymore. What happens when we get back? She asked quietly. We get you to a doctor. And then? Then we figure it out. Figure what out? Silas didn't answer right away. He didn't know how to. They'd been so focused on surviving the next hour, the next mile, that he hadn't let himself think about what came after. I don't know, he admitted, but we'll figure it out together. Vivian gave him a look he couldn't read. Then she stood up, or tried to. Her legs buckled immediately, and she would have fallen if Silas hadn't caught her. Easy, he said, steadying her. I hate this, she said through gritted teeth. I hate being helpless. You're not helpless. You're hurt. There's a difference. Doesn't feel like it. He helped her back into the sling, adjusting the straps more carefully this time. She winced as the rope pressed against her shoulders, but she didn't complain. They kept moving. The next 3 days blurred together into a haze of pain and exhaustion. Silas pushed himself harder than he ever had, covering ground that should have taken a week in half the time. He stopped only when he absolutely had to, sleeping in short bursts while Vivian lay beside him, too weak to do anything but breathe. On the morning of the 4th day, they finally reached the lower valley. Silas could see the ranch in the distance, a dark shape against the snow. He almost cried with relief. But Vivian was worse. Her skin had taken on a waxy sheen, and her breathing was shallow and irregular. The frostbite was spreading, and Silas knew they were running out of time. He carried her the last 2 miles without stopping, ignoring the way his vision blurred and his legs threatened to give out. When he finally reached the house, he kicked the door open and laid her on the bed. Then he collapsed on the floor, his body refusing to move another inch. He woke up sometime later to the sound of hoofbeats outside. He dragged himself to his feet and stumbled to the door. Tom Ridley was there along with Doc Warren from town. We saw smoke from your chimney, Tom said. Thought we'd check. He stopped when he saw Silas's face. Jesus, what happened to you? Get the doctor inside, Silas said, his voice raw. Now. Doc Warren pushed past him and went straight to the bed. He took one look at Vivian and started barking orders. Tom helped him set up, bringing in supplies from the wagon, while Silas stood against the wall, useless and shaking. The doctor worked for over an hour. When he finally stepped back, his expression was grim. She's alive, he said. Barely. But she's lost too much tissue to the frostbite. The infection's already setting in. Can you save her? Silas asked. I can try, but I'm going to have to amputate. The word hit Silas like a physical blow. How much? 3 fingers on her left hand, and... Doc Warren hesitated. Both legs. Below the knee. Silas felt the room tilt. He grabbed the doorframe to steady himself. If I don't, the doctor continued, the infection will spread. She'll be dead in a week. Do it, Silas said. Silas, you need to understand... I said do it. Doc Warren nodded slowly. I'll need to take her into town. I don't have the equipment here. Then take her. They loaded Vivian into the wagon as carefully as they could. She was barely conscious, her eyes half open and unfocused. Silas climbed in beside her and took her good hand in his. I'm right here, he said quietly. I'm not going anywhere. Her fingers tightened around his, just barely. The ride to town took forever. Every bump in the road made Vivian whimper, and Silas felt each sound like a knife. When they finally reached the doctor's office, a small building behind the general store, Doc Warren and Tom carried her inside while Silas followed. They laid her on a table in the back room. The doctor started preparing his instruments, laying them out with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd done this too many times. You should wait outside, Doc Warren said. No. Silas, I'm staying. The doctor looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Hold her down. This is going to be bad. It was worse than bad. It was hell. Vivian screamed. She fought. She begged them to stop. and Silas held her down while the doctor sawed through bone and tissue, hating himself with every second that passed. When it was finally over, Vivian had gone silent. Not unconscious, Silas could see her eyes were still open, but somewhere beyond pain, somewhere he couldn't reach. Doc Warren bandaged the stumps carefully, wrapping them in clean cloth. Then he stepped back, wiping blood off his hands. She needs rest. Lots of it. And she'll need help learning to walk again, if she survives the next few days. She'll survive, Silas said. His voice didn't sound like his own. The doctor didn't argue. Silas stayed by Vivian's side for the next 3 days. He didn't leave, didn't sleep, just sat in a chair beside the bed, watching her breathe. The town talked, of course. People whispered about the fool rancher and his half-dead mail-order bride, about how he should have left her in the mountains, about how she'd be nothing but a burden now. Silas ignored them all. On the 3rd day, Vivian woke up. She stared at the ceiling for a long time, her expression blank. Then, slowly, she turned her head and looked at Silas. "I'm still here," she said quietly. "Yes, you are." She looked down at the blankets covering her body, at the empty space where her legs should have been. Her face didn't change. "You should have left me in the mountains." "No." "Silas, no." He leaned forward, his voice steady. "You don't get to tell me what I should have done. I made my choice, and I'd make it again." Vivian's eyes filled with tears. She didn't try to hide them. "I can't walk. Not yet. Maybe not ever. We'll see." She shook her head. "You don't understand. You're alive," Silas interrupted. "Everything else we'll figure out." And for the first time since he'd found her in that cabin, Vivian Hale started to cry. Silas let her cry. He didn't try to comfort her with empty words or false promises. He just sat there, holding her hand, while she sobbed into the pillow like something inside her had finally broken free. When the tears finally stopped, Vivian lay exhausted, staring at the wall. Her face was blotchy and swollen, her eyes red-rimmed. She looked worse than she had in the cabin, and that was saying something. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice hoarse. "Stop apologizing. I can't help it. I feel—" She stopped, searching for the word. "Humiliated." "Why?" "Because you've seen me at my worst. Because I'm lying here like a broken doll, and you're—" She gestured vaguely at him. "You're sitting there looking at me like I'm something worth saving. You are worth saving. You don't know that. I know enough." Vivian turned her head away. "You know what the worst part is? I spent 3 weeks in those mountains telling myself that if I could just make it to you, everything would be all right, that you'd be there, and we'd figure things out together, and somehow it would all work." She laughed bitterly. "I was an idiot." "You weren't an idiot. You were trying to survive. And look where it got me." Silas leaned back in his chair, studying her. She was angry. At herself, at the situation, at him for not letting her give up. He understood that. Anger was easier than grief, easier than fear. "You want to know what I think?" he said. "Not particularly. I think you're scared, and I think you're looking for reasons to push me away before I can walk out on my own." Vivian's jaw tightened. "That's not—" "Yes, it is." His voice was calm, matter of fact. "You think I'm going to see you like this and decide you're not worth the trouble, that I'll leave you here and go back to my ranch and forget you ever existed." She didn't answer, but the way she looked at him told him he'd hit the mark. "I'm not going anywhere," Silas said. "I told you that in the cabin. I told you that in the wagon, and I'm telling you now. So you can keep waiting for me to disappear, or you can accept that I meant what I said." Vivian stared at him for a long moment. Then, quietly, she said, "Why? Why what? Why do you care? You didn't know me before all this. We exchanged some letters. That's it. You don't owe me anything." Silas thought about that. It was a fair question, one he'd asked himself more than once over the past few days. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe because you came all this way based on nothing but words on paper. Maybe because you survived something that should have killed you 10 times over. Maybe because when I found you in that cabin, you were still fighting." He paused. "Or maybe I'm just tired of being alone." The honesty of it seemed to catch Vivian off guard. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, like she didn't know what to say. Before she could respond, the door opened and Doc Warren came in, carrying a tray with bandages and a bottle of something that smelled sharp and medicinal. "How's the patient?" he asked. "Alive," Vivian said flatly. "That's a start." The doctor set the tray down and began unwrapping the bandages on her left hand. "I need to check for infection. This might hurt." "Everything hurts." "Fair enough." Silas watched as Doc Warren examined the stumps where Vivian's fingers had been. The flesh was raw and angry-looking, stitched together with black thread that made Silas's stomach turn. But there were no red streaks spreading up her arm, no sign of the poison that could turn a wound deadly. "Looks clean," the doctor said. "You're lucky." Vivian snorted. "Lucky. Right." Doc Warren ignored the sarcasm and moved to her legs, peeling back the blankets. Silas looked away, giving her what privacy he could. He heard the rustle of bandages being unwrapped, the doctor's low murmur as he worked. "Same here," Doc Warren said after a moment. "No infection. The tissue's healing well, considering." He rewrapped the bandages with practiced efficiency. "You'll need to stay off these for at least another week. After that, we'll see about getting you fitted for prosthetics." "Prosthetics," Vivian repeated like the word was foreign. "Wooden legs. They're not perfect, but they'll let you walk again. Eventually." "How long is eventually?" "Depends. Some people take to them quick, others never do." The doctor packed up his supplies. "But you're young and strong. I'd say you've got a better chance than most." After he left, Vivian lay very still, staring at the ceiling. Silas could see the wheels turning in her head, working through the reality of what her life was going to look like now. "I can't stay here," she said finally. "Why not?" "Because I can't pay for it. I don't have any money. Everything I owned was in that stagecoach." "I'll cover it." "Silas, I said I'll cover it." "And then what? I go back to Boston? Try to find work as a seamstress who can't stand up? You come back to the ranch with me." Vivian turned her head sharply. "What? You heard me?" "That's—" She stopped, her expression caught between disbelief and something else. "That's not what we agreed to. We agreed you'd come out here to marry me. That part hasn't changed." "Everything's changed. Look at me." "I am looking at you. Silas, I can't—" Her voice cracked. "I can't be a wife to you, not like this. I can't cook or clean or take care of a house. I can't even walk. Not yet. Maybe not ever." "Then we'll figure it out." Vivian shook her head. "You keep saying that. Figure it out. Like it's simple." "It is simple. You need a place to go. I've got one. You need help getting back on your feet. I can give you that. And when you're ready, if you still want to, we'll get married." "And if I don't want to?" Silas met her gaze steadily. "Then you don't. But either way, you're coming back to the ranch. You've got nowhere else to go, and I'm not leaving you to rot in some charity ward." For a moment, Vivian looked like she wanted to argue. Then the fight went out of her, and she slumped back against the pillow. "You're the most stubborn man I've ever met," she said. "I've been told that before. I don't understand you." "You don't have to." She closed her eyes. "Fine. I'll come to your ranch. But only until I can figure out what to do next." "Fine. And I'm not marrying you." "We'll see." Her eyes snapped open. "I mean it, Silas." "So do I." They stared at each other for a long moment. Then, despite everything, the corner of Vivian's mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. "You're impossible," she said. "So are you." 2 weeks later, Silas brought Vivian back to the ranch. Tom Ridley helped him load her into the wagon, patting the bed with every blanket and pillow they could find. The ride was rough, even with Silas taking the road as slow as he could manage. Every bump made Vivian wince, her hands gripping the side of the wagon until her knuckles went white. When they finally pulled into the yard, Vivian looked around with an expression Silas couldn't quite read. The ranch was small and weathered, the kind of place that had seen better days. The barn needed new shingles, the fence was sagging in places. The house itself was sturdy enough, but it looked lonely sitting there in the valley with nothing but mountains and sky around it. "It's not much," Silas said, helping her down from the wagon. "It's more than I have." He carried her inside and set her on the bed in the main room. It was the only real bedroom in the house. Silas had been sleeping in the loft since his wife died. He'd cleaned the place as best he could before bringing Vivian home, scrubbing the floors and washing the windows and airing out the musty smell that had settled in over the years. But it still felt empty, like a house that had forgotten how to be lived in. Vivian looked around slowly, taking in the sparse furniture and bare walls. "Where will you sleep? Loft? That doesn't seem fair?" "It's fine. I've been sleeping up there for years." She didn't argue, but he could see the discomfort on her face, the sense that she was displacing him, taking something that wasn't hers. Over the next few days, they settled into an awkward routine. Silas would wake before dawn to tend the animals and do the endless work the ranch required. Vivian would stay in bed, staring at the ceiling or out the window, her face blank. He'd come back in at midday to check on her, bring her food, help her with things she couldn't do herself. It was strange having another person in the house again. Strange hearing someone else breathe in the quiet. Strange knowing he wasn't alone. But it was also hard. Harder than Silas had expected. Vivian didn't like being helpless. That much was clear. She hated having to ask for help getting dressed or using the chamber pot or moving from the bed to the chair by the window. She hated that her body wouldn't do what she told it to. And most of all, she hated that Silas had to see her like this. "I used to be independent," she said one afternoon, her voice tight with frustration. "I took care of myself. I didn't need anyone. Everyone needs someone eventually." "That's easy for you to say. You're not the one lying here like dead weight." Silas set down the bowl of soup he'd been trying to get her to eat. "You're not dead weight. You're recovering. It's been 3 weeks. I should be better by now." "It doesn't work like that." "How would you know?" "I don't. But Doc Warren said it'd take time, so we give it time." Vivian looked away, her jaw set. "I hate this." "I know. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, you seem perfectly fine with me being a burden." Silas felt his temper spike. He took a breath, forcing it down. "You want to know what I think? I think you're so busy hating yourself that you can't see anything else. You're alive, Vivian. You survived something that would have killed most people. But instead of being grateful for that, you're sitting here tearing yourself apart because you're not healing fast enough." "That's not—" "Yes, it is." He stood up, his voice harder now. "You want to feel sorry for yourself? Fine. Go ahead, but don't expect me to join in." He walked out before she could respond, slamming the door harder than he meant to. Outside, the wind was cold and sharp, cutting through his coat. Silas stood in the yard, his hands shaking, trying to calm down. He wasn't angry at Vivian. Not really. He was angry at the situation, at the unfairness of it, at the fact that she'd fought so hard to survive only to wake up in a world that didn't care. But yelling at her hadn't helped. It had just made things worse. He went to the barn and lost himself in work, mucking stalls and fixing tack until his hands stopped shaking. When he finally went back inside, it was dark. Vivian was asleep, or pretending to be. Silas climbed up to the loft without a word. The next morning, he woke to the sound of something crashing downstairs. He scrambled down the ladder and found Vivian on the floor, tangled in blankets, her face twisted in pain and fury. "What happened?" "I tried to get up," she said through gritted teeth. "I thought if I could just—" She stopped, her voice breaking. "I'm so stupid." Silas crossed the room and knelt beside her. "You're not stupid. I forgot I don't have legs." "You've got legs. They just don't work the same way." "That's not the same thing." "No, it's not." He helped her back onto the bed, careful not to jostle the bandaged stumps. "But it's what we're working with." Vivian covered her face with her hands. "I can't do this." "Yes, you can." "How do you know?" "Because you've already done harder things." She lowered her hands and looked at him. Her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying. "You really believe that, don't you?" "I do." "Why?" "Because I saw what you survived out there. And if you can survive that, you can survive this." For a moment, Vivian didn't say anything. Then quietly she said, "I'm sorry I snapped at you yesterday. I'm sorry I walked out. You had a right to. Maybe. But it didn't help." She nodded slowly. "Can we start over?" We never stopped. Something shifted between them after that. Not all at once, but gradually. Vivian stopped fighting every offer of help. Started asking questions about the ranch, about the valley, about Silas's life before she came. And Silas, for his part, stopped treating her like she was made of glass. He started talking to her like she was a person, not a patient. Told her stories about the land, about the winters that could break a man, about the quiet satisfaction of fixing something with your own hands. One evening, about a month after she'd come to the ranch, Silas came in from the barn to find Vivian sitting at the table. Not in bed. At the table. She'd managed to drag herself over using a chair as support, and now she sat there, looking exhausted but triumphant. "Don't say anything," she said when she saw his expression. Silas held up his hands. "Wasn't going to." "Liar," he smiled. "All right. I was going to say I'm impressed. It took me half an hour to get here. Doesn't matter, you did it." Vivian looked down at the table, her expression complicated. "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About what you said. About getting married." Silas's chest tightened. And I think... She stopped, choosing her words carefully. "I think I need to be able to take care of myself first, before I can think about being a wife to anyone. That's fair?" "Really?" "Really." Silas sat down across from her. "I'm not going to push you into something you're not ready for. We'll take it slow. Figure things out as we go." "You keep saying that." "Because it's true." Vivian shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You're a strange man, Silas Boone." "I've been told." The prosthetics arrived 6 weeks later. Doc Warren brought them out himself, 2 wooden legs carved and fitted based on measurements he'd taken. They looked crude to Silas, with leather straps and metal hinges, but the doctor assured him they were the best available. Vivian stared at them like they were instruments of torture. "I don't know if I can do this," she said. "You don't have to decide now," Doc Warren said. "Take your time. Get used to the idea." But Vivian was stubborn. She insisted on trying them that same day. Silas and the doctor helped her strap them on, adjusting the fit until they sat as comfortably as possible against the healed stumps. Then they helped her stand. She lasted about 3 seconds before her legs buckled, and she would have fallen if Silas hadn't caught her. "Damn it," she hissed, her face pale with pain. "Easy," Silas said. "Don't push too hard." "I'm not pushing hard enough." "Vivian..." Again. They tried again and again and again. Each time, Vivian managed to stand a little longer before collapsing. By the end of the day, she was trembling with exhaustion, her face slick with sweat. But she'd taken 3 steps. "That's enough for today," Doc Warren said firmly. "Any more, and you'll hurt yourself." Vivian didn't argue. She let them help her back to bed, where she lay staring at the ceiling, her expression distant. After the doctor left, Silas sat down beside her. "You did good today. I fell a dozen times. And you got back up every time." She turned her head to look at him. "How long do you think it'll take before I can walk on my own?" "I don't know. Weeks, maybe months." "That's a long time." "We've got time." Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What if I never get good at it? What if I'm always like this, slow and clumsy and needing help?" "Then we'll deal with it." "You keep saying that." "Because it's the truth." She closed her eyes. "You're too patient with me." "Maybe you're too hard on yourself." "Maybe." She opened her eyes again, studying him. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why did you really come looking for me? And don't give me that line about promises or duty. I want the real reason." Silas thought about it for a long time. He wasn't good with words, never had been. But Vivian deserved honesty. "Because your letters made me feel less alone," he said finally. "Because when I read them, I felt like someone saw me. Not the rancher or the widower or the quiet man everyone avoids, just me." He paused. "And because I thought if I let you die out there, I'd be letting go of the only thing that made me feel human in a long time." Vivian stared at him, her eyes bright. "That's the most you've ever said to me at once." "Don't get used to it." She smiled, a real smile this time, not the bitter half thing she usually gave him. "Thank you, Silas." "For what?" "For not giving up on me." "You didn't give up on yourself, I just helped." Over the next 3 months, Vivian learned to walk again. It was brutal, watching her fall and get back up, over and over, her face tight with pain and determination. Some days she made progress. Other days she couldn't even stand. But she never quit. Silas built her parallel bars in the main room, 2 sturdy rails she could hold on to while she practiced. He patted the floor with old blankets so the falls wouldn't hurt as much. And every evening, after the ranch work was done, he'd stand at the end of the rails and wait for her to walk to him. At first, she could barely make it halfway, but slowly, painfully, she got stronger. Her balance improved. Her steps became steadier, and one evening in late summer, she walked the full length of the bars without falling. "I did it," she said, breathless and grinning. "You did." "I actually did it." Silas found himself grinning back. "Told you you could." Vivian laughed, a sound he'd heard so rarely it caught him off guard. "Don't start gloating. Wouldn't dream of it." But the progress came with costs. Vivian's stumps were covered in blisters and sores from the wooden legs rubbing against her skin. She developed a limp favoring her left side because the right prosthetic never fit quite right, and some mornings the pain was so bad she couldn't get out of bed. On those days, Silas would sit with her, reading aloud from the old newspapers he picked up in town, or just talking about nothing in particular. He told her about his plans for the ranch, about the cattle he wanted to buy, about the creek that ran dry every August and drove him half crazy. And Vivian slowly started to open up too. She told him about Boston, about her mother who died when she was 12, about the years she'd spent working for a woman who treated her employees like servants. She told him about Richard, the man who'd courted her for 2 years before marrying someone with a bigger dowry. She told him about the loneliness that had driven her to answer Silas's advertisement in the first place. "I wanted to matter to someone," she said one evening. "I wanted a life that was mine, not something I borrowed from someone else's kindness." "You matter," Silas said. "I know that now." By autumn, Vivian could walk without the bars. She still needed a cane, and she couldn't go far without resting, but she could move around the house on her own. She started helping with small tasks, mending clothes, organizing the pantry, keeping the accounts. Things that didn't require standing for long periods, but still made her feel useful. One morning, Silas came in from the barn to find her at the stove, attempting to make breakfast. The eggs were burned and the coffee was weak, but she looked so proud of herself that he didn't have the heart to say anything. "It's awful, isn't it?" she said, catching his expression. "It's not that bad." "You're a terrible liar." "I've had worse." She laughed and dumped the eggs onto a plate. "Eat it anyway. I worked hard on this disaster." They sat at the table together, eating burned eggs and drinking weak coffee, and Silas realized something had changed. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt lived in, like a home. That night, after Vivian had gone to bed, Silas sat in the loft staring at the rafters. He'd told himself he was giving her space, letting her heal before bringing up marriage again. But the truth was, he was scared. Scared she'd say no. Scared she'd say yes for the wrong reasons. Scared that what they had now, this quiet partnership, this slow-building trust, would break if he pushed too hard. But he also knew he couldn't wait forever. The next morning, he made a decision. He waited until after breakfast, when Vivian was sitting by the window with her mending. The morning light caught her face just right, and for a moment Silas could see past the exhaustion and the scars to the woman who'd written him those letters. The woman who'd promised to come to Colorado and make a life with him. "I need to ask you something," he said. Vivian looked up from the shirt she was hemming. "All right." Silas pulled a chair over and sat down across from her. His hands felt clumsy, and he couldn't quite figure out what to do with them. Finally, he just folded them in his lap. "We've been living like this for 6 months now," he said. "You doing your part, me doing mine. And it's worked. Better than I thought it would. Is this going somewhere?" "I'm getting there." He took a breath. "I know you said you weren't ready to think about marriage, and I respect that. But I need to know if that's ever going to change, or if I should stop hoping." Vivian set down her mending, her expression carefully neutral. "Why now?" "Because I can't keep pretending this is temporary. Because every day I wake up and you're here, and I don't want to imagine what it'd be like if you weren't." "Silas? Let me finish." His voice was rougher than he intended. "I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not even asking you to want this. I'm just asking if you can see a future where we're more than 2 people sharing a house." Vivian was quiet for a long time. Outside, a crow called from the fence line, harsh and lonely. Finally, she spoke. "I've been thinking about this too," she said, "about what we are, what we could be. And I don't know if I can give you what you're looking for. I don't know if I'll ever be She gestured vaguely at herself. Whole enough for marriage. You are whole. I'm missing pieces, Silas, literal pieces. So am I, just not the kind you can see. That stopped her. She looked at him, really looked at him, like she was trying to see past his words to whatever truth he was hiding. What do you mean? Silas leaned back in his chair, suddenly tired. My wife, Sarah. I loved her. Loved her so much it felt like my chest was going to crack open sometimes. But I wasn't good at showing it. I worked too much. Didn't talk enough. And when she was pregnant, I thought we'd have time. Time to fix things. Time to be better. He stopped, his throat tight. We didn't get that time. Vivian's face softened. I'm sorry. Point is, I've been carrying that around for 3 years. The weight of all the things I should have said and didn't. All the ways I failed her. He met Vivian's eyes. So when I say you're whole, I mean it. Because being whole isn't about having all your parts. It's about still being willing to try. And you've been trying since the day I found you. Vivian's eyes were bright with unshed tears. You're not making this easy. I'm not trying to make it easy. I'm trying to make it honest. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, frustrated. I need time to think. Take all the time you need. But she didn't take long. 3 days later, she found him in the barn repairing a broken harness. She stood in the doorway, leaning heavily on her cane, her face set with determination. I've made a decision, she said. Silas set down the leather strap he'd been working on. I'm listening. I'll marry you, but on one condition. What's that? That you stop looking at me like I'm going to break. I'm not made of glass, and I'm tired of being treated like I am. Silas felt something loosen in his chest. Relief, maybe. Or hope. That's it? That's it? Then we've got a deal. Vivian smiled, small and uncertain. When do you want to do this? Whenever you're ready. I'm ready now. They were married 2 weeks later in the parlor of Judge Whitman's house in Silver Ridge. It was a small ceremony. Just the judge, his wife as witness, and Tom Ridley, who'd insisted on being there despite Silas's protests. Vivian wore a simple blue dress she'd altered herself, letting out the waist and shortening the hem so it wouldn't catch on her prosthetics. Silas wore his only good suit, the one he'd been married in the first time, and tried not to think about how different this felt. The judge read the words quickly, like he had somewhere else to be. Silas repeated his vows in a voice that didn't quite sound like his own. And when it was Vivian's turn, she spoke so quietly he almost missed it. I do. They signed the papers. The judge's wife offered them tea, which they declined, and then they were back in the wagon, heading home as husband and wife. The ride was quiet. Vivian stared out at the valley, her hands folded in her lap. Silas kept his eyes on the road, trying to figure out what he was supposed to say. Congratulations felt wrong. So did asking if she was all right. Finally, he just settled for silence. When they got back to the ranch, Vivian went straight to the bedroom and closed the door. Silas stood in the main room, feeling like a stranger in his own house. He waited for her to come back out. When she didn't, he went to the barn and threw himself into work until dark. That night, he climbed up to the loft like he had every night for the past 6 months. He lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of Vivian moving around downstairs, and wondered if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. The next morning, when he came down the ladder, Vivian was already awake. She'd made coffee and was sitting at the table with a ledger book spread in front of her. I've been looking at the accounts, she said without preamble. Silas poured himself coffee. And you're hemorrhaging money. The feed costs alone are going to bankrupt you before spring. I know. Then why haven't you done anything about it? Because I've been busy keeping you alive. Vivian looked up sharply. That's not an excuse. Wasn't meant to be, just a fact. She closed the ledger with more force than necessary. Well, we need to fix it, starting now. Silas sat down across from her. You got ideas? A few, but I'll need your help. I'm listening. Over the next hour, Vivian laid out a plan. Cut back on feed by rotating pastures better. Sell off the weaker stock before winter. Repair the fences so they stopped losing cattle to wandering. Find a buyer in Denver for the spring calves instead of selling local at half price. It was practical, smart. The kind of thing Silas should have thought of himself but hadn't because he'd been too buried in day-to-day survival to see the bigger picture. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "I needed something to do besides feel sorry for myself." "This is good work, Vivian." She shrugged, but he could see the pleasure in her face. "It's just numbers." "It's more than that. It's a way forward." They started implementing her plan that week. Silas spent long days in the saddle, rounding up cattle and checking fences. Vivian took over the books completely, tracking every cent that came in and went out. She also started managing the household with a precision that bordered on ruthless, rationing supplies, preserving food, finding ways to stretch a dollar until it screamed. At night, they fell into an uneasy routine. Silas would come in exhausted, eat whatever Vivian had managed to cobble together for dinner, and then retreat to the loft. They didn't talk much, didn't touch. It felt less like a marriage and more like a business arrangement. One evening, about a month after the wedding, Vivian broke the silence. "This isn't working," she said. Silas looked up from his plate. "What isn't?" "This. Us. Living like strangers." "I thought that's what you wanted." "I never said that." "You closed the door on our wedding night and didn't open it for 3 days. What was I supposed to think?" Vivian set down her fork. "I was scared." "Of what?" "Of disappointing you. Of not being—" She stopped, searching for words. "Of not being enough." Silas felt something twist in his chest. "You think I married you because I was expecting something from you? Didn't you? I married you because I wanted a partner, someone to build a life with. That's it. But I can't—" She gestured at herself, frustrated. "I can't do half the things a wife is supposed to do." "Says who?" "Says everyone, says the world." "The world can go to hell." Silas's voice was harder now. "You want to know what I care about? I care that you're smart enough to save this ranch from going under. I care that you don't give up when things get hard. I care that you're sitting here right now having this conversation instead of pretending everything's fine." He paused. "That's what I need from a wife. The rest of it, we'll figure it out as we go." Vivian's eyes were bright again, but she wasn't crying. "You really mean that? Every word?" She stood up, leaning on the table for support. "Then stop sleeping in the loft." "Vivian, I mean it, Silas. We're married. We should at least share the same room." "If that's what you want." "It is." That night, Silas moved his things down from the loft. They didn't touch beyond the accidental brush of hands as they got ready for bed. But lying there in the dark, listening to Vivian breathe beside him, Silas felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. The ranch started to turn around slowly. The changes Vivian had suggested began to pay off. They sold the weak stock before winter hit, bringing in enough cash to buy feed and repair the barn roof. The fence work paid dividends. They didn't lose a single head of cattle to wandering. And when spring came, Silas made the trip to Denver with the calves and came back with 3 times what he would have gotten in Silver Ridge. Vivian met him at the door when he got home, her face tight with worry that melted into relief when she saw him. "I was starting to think you'd gotten lost," she said. "Just took longer than I thought." He handed her the money pouch. "Count it." She did, her eyes going wide. Silas, this is incredible. Your plan, your credit, our plan." She looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd known her, she was smiling without reservation. "We did it. We're not out of the woods yet, but we're close, closer than we've been in years." Silas felt something warm spread through his chest. "Yeah, we are." That night, they celebrated with a bottle of whiskey Silas had been saving for a special occasion. They sat at the table, passing the bottle back and forth, talking about plans for the ranch, about buying more cattle, about fixing up the house, about the future. At some point, Vivian reached across the table and took his hand. It was the first time she'd initiated touch since the wedding. Her grip was warm and solid, her fingers laced through his. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not giving up on me. On us." Silas squeezed her hand. "Same to you." They sat there for a while, just holding hands across the table, the lamplight flickering between them. And Silas thought that maybe this was what marriage was supposed to feel like. Not grand gestures or perfect moments, just 2 people choosing each other, day after day, despite everything. The summer was hard work. They hired a couple of ranch hands to help with the cattle. two brothers from town who were willing to work cheap in exchange for a place to sleep and 3 meals a day. Vivian managed them with the same precision she brought to the books, making sure they earned every cent Silas paid them. She also started taking on more physical work. She couldn't ride or rope or do the heavy lifting, but she could mend tack and organize supplies and keep track of which pastures had been rotated. She moved through the ranch with her cane and her wooden legs, refusing to let her limitations slow her down. The town noticed. People started talking about the Boone Ranch again, but this time it wasn't pity or mockery. It was respect. Grudging at first, but real. One afternoon, Frank Carraway showed up at the ranch with his hat in his hands and an uncomfortable expression on his face. "Silas," he said when Silas came out to meet him. "Frank, Frank shifted his weight. "I wanted to apologize for what I said, back when you were waiting for the stage." Silas crossed his arms. "That was over a year ago." "I know, but I was wrong. About your wife, about you. What changed your mind?" Frank glanced toward the house where Vivian was visible through the window, working at the table. "Heard she turned this place around. Heard she's got a head for business." "She does." "Well," Frank put his hat back on, "I just wanted to say it, that I was wrong." He turned to leave, but Silas stopped him. "Frank." "Yeah?" "Appreciate you coming out here." Frank nodded and rode off. Silas watched him go, then went back inside. Vivian looked up from her work. Who was that? Nobody important. But Vivian saw through him. He apologized, didn't he? How'd you know? Because people are starting to realize we're not going anywhere, she smiled. About time, don't you think? Yeah, about time. That fall, they harvested their first real profit in years. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to pay off debts and put money aside for winter. Enough to prove that the ranch could survive, that they could survive. One evening in late October, Silas came in from the barn to find Vivian sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket against the cold. She was staring out at the valley, her expression distant. He sat down beside her. You all right? I was just thinking. About what? About how different my life is now. How a year ago, I was in Boston working in that dress shop, hating every minute of it, and now I'm here. She turned to look at him. Do you ever wonder how things would have turned out if the stagecoach hadn't crashed? Sometimes. Do you think we would have been happy if everything had gone according to plan? Silas thought about that. I don't know, maybe, but I don't think we would have been this. What do you mean? I mean, we wouldn't have built what we have now. We would have been strangers trying to make something work. Instead, He stopped, searching for the right word. Partners, Vivian finished. Yeah, partners. She leaned her head against his shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. I'm glad you found me, Silas. So am I. They sat there as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The valley was quiet, except for the wind and the distant sound of cattle settling in for the night. And Silas felt something he hadn't felt since before Sarah died. Contentment. Winter came hard that year, the kind of winter that tested everything. Snow piled up past the windows. The temperature dropped so low that water froze solid in the well. The ranch hands went home to their families, leaving Silas and Vivian to manage alone. It should have been brutal, and in some ways it was. But they'd prepared. They had enough feed stockpiled, enough firewood, enough supplies to last until spring. And they had each other. On the longest nights, when the wind howled and the cold seeped through every crack in the walls, they sat by the fire and talked. About everything and nothing. About their pasts. About their hopes for the future. About the small victories and large failures that had brought them to this moment. Vivian told him about her childhood in Boston. About the mother who'd taught her to sew and died too young. About the years of loneliness that had followed. About the desperate hope that had driven her to answer his advertisement. Silas told her about growing up in the mountains, about learning to ranch from his father, who died when Silas was 17. About Sarah, about the guilt that had eaten at him for years, about the emptiness that had filled his life until Vivian's letters started arriving. I think we were both looking for the same thing, Vivian said one night, a way to stop being alone. You think we found it? She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Yes, I think we did. Silas reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. It was a simple gesture, but it felt significant, like crossing a line they'd been dancing around for months. Vivian didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. Silas, she said softly. Yeah? I think I might love you. The words hit him like a physical blow. Not painful, just overwhelming. He pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her and pressed his face into her hair. I know I love you, he said. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other while the fire burned down and the wind screamed outside. And when they finally went to bed, for the first time since their wedding night, they didn't stay on opposite sides of the mattress. Spring came eventually, the way it always did. The snow melted. The creek ran high and fast. The valley turned green again, and the cattle that had survived the winter looked healthy and strong. Silas and Vivian worked side by side, rebuilding what the winter had damaged and planning for the year ahead. They hired the ranch hands back, bought a bull to improve the herd, started talking about expanding the house, adding a proper bedroom, and maybe a room for... For what? Vivian asked when Silas brought it up. He hesitated. For whatever we might need it for. She looked at him for a long moment, understanding dawning in her eyes. Silas, I don't know if I can... I'm not asking you to, I'm just saying we should build it anyway, just in case. Vivian smiled, soft and sad. All right, just in case. They built the addition that summer. It took months of hard work, but by autumn they had 2 new rooms attached to the house. One became a proper bedroom. The other stayed empty, waiting. One evening, standing in that empty room, Vivian turned to Silas. Do you regret it? She asked. Marrying me instead of someone who could give you children? No. Even though, no, he repeated more firmly. I married you because I wanted you, not some idea of what a wife should be. You. Vivian's eyes filled with tears. I wish I could give you more. You've given me everything that matters. She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him. He held her tight, feeling the way her body fit against his, solid and real and alive. I love you, she whispered. I love you too. The years that followed weren't easy. There were hard seasons and lean times. There were arguments and frustrations and moments when the weight of everything threatened to crush them both. But they weathered it together, the way they'd weathered everything else. The ranch grew. They added more cattle, more land. They built a new barn and repaired the old one. They became known in the valley as the couple who'd survived the impossible, who'd built something real out of tragedy and loss. And slowly, carefully, they built something else too. Not the life they'd planned, not the fairy tale either of them had once imagined, but a life that was theirs. 3 years into their marriage, a woman showed up at the ranch with a baby wrapped in blankets and desperation written all over her face. Her name was Clara Morrison, and she was barely 20. Her husband had died in a mining accident 2 months prior, leaving her with a 3-month-old daughter and no way to feed either of them. She'd heard about the Boones, about how Vivian had survived the impossible and turned a failing ranch into something profitable. She'd come looking for work. I can cook, Clara said, standing in the doorway with the baby fussing in her arms. I can clean. I can do whatever you need. Her voice cracked. I just need a place to stay, somewhere safe. Vivian looked at Silas. He looked back at her. They didn't need to speak. After 3 years together, they'd learned to read each other without words. You can stay in the bunkhouse, Vivian said. The hands are gone for the season, so you'll have it to yourself. We'll work out wages once we see what you can do. Clara's face crumpled with relief. Thank you. Thank you so much. The baby, Emma, was colicky and loud. She cried through the nights, her wails carrying across the yard to the main house. Vivian would lie awake listening, her hand resting on Silas's chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. You all right? He asked one night. Yeah, just thinking. About what? About how that could have been me, if things had gone differently, if I'd had a child and lost you instead of the other way around. Silas pulled her closer. But that's not what happened. I know, but it makes me think about... She stopped, unable to finish. About what we don't have. Yes. They lay in silence for a while, listening to Emma cry in the distance. Finally, Vivian spoke again. Do you think we made a mistake, building that extra room? No. It's just sitting there empty. A reminder of what we can't. It's not empty, Silas interrupted. It's waiting. For what? I don't know yet, but something. Clara proved herself quickly. She was a hard worker, efficient and thorough. She cooked meals that were actually edible, kept the house cleaner than it had been in years, and managed to do it all while caring for Emma. Vivian liked her immediately. There was something familiar in the way Clara moved through the world, wary but determined, like a woman who'd learned not to expect kindness but was grateful when she found it. One afternoon, Vivian was teaching Clara how to manage the ranch accounts when Emma started fussing. Clara moved to get her, but Vivian stopped her. "Let me," she said. Clara hesitated. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." Vivian crossed the room, leaning heavily on her cane. She'd gotten better at walking over the years, but the prosthetic still hurt on bad days, and today was a bad day. She reached the cradle and looked down at Emma, who was red-faced and squalling. "Hey now," Vivian said softly, reaching down to pick her up. "What's all this noise about?" The moment Emma was in her arms, something shifted. The baby was warm and solid, her tiny hands grasping at Vivian's dress. She smelled like milk and soap and something indefinably sweet. Vivian felt her chest tighten. She told herself she was fine with not having children, that she'd accepted it. But holding Emma, feeling the weight of her, the trust in how she settled against Vivian's shoulder, it hurt in a way she hadn't expected. Clara was watching her with an expression Vivian couldn't quite read. "You're good with her," Clara said. "I've just got her fooled." "No, you're natural at it." Vivian didn't know what to say to that, so she just rocked Emma gently until the crying stopped and the baby's breathing evened out into sleep. That night, Silas found Vivian sitting on the porch, staring out at nothing. "Clara told me you held Emma today," he said, sitting down beside her. She was crying. "That's not what I mean." Vivian turned to look at him. "What do you want me to say, Silas?" "I want you to be honest about what you're feeling." She was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was raw. "It hurts. Holding her, seeing Clara with her. It makes me think about everything I can't give you." "Vivian, I know you say it doesn't matter. I know you say you're happy with what we have. But sometimes I wonder if you're just being kind. If deep down you wish you'd married someone else. Someone whole." Silas took her hand. "You want to know what I wish?" "What?" "I wish you'd stop punishing yourself for things that aren't your fault. I wish you'd believe me when I say I'm exactly where I want to be." He paused. "And I wish you'd stop thinking that having children is the only way to build a family." "What do you mean?" "I mean, look at what we've already done. We took in Clara and Emma when they had nowhere else to go. We've helped Tom Ridley get back on his feet after he lost his job. We've loaned money to half the ranchers in this valley to get them through hard times." He squeezed her hand. "We've built something bigger than just the two of us. That's family, too." Vivian felt tears spill down her cheeks. "When did you get so wise?" "I've been spending too much time with you. It's rubbing off." She laughed, even as she cried. "I love you." "I love you, too." The following spring, Clara married one of the ranch hands, a quiet man named James who'd been courting her all winter. They had the wedding at the ranch, a simple ceremony with just a handful of people. Vivian stood as Clara's witness, and Silas stood for James, and afterwards they had a dinner that lasted until dark. As Clara and James danced in the yard, Vivian watched with Silas beside her. "Think they'll be happy?" she asked. "I think they'll try. That's all anyone can do." "Is that what we do? Try? Every day?" Vivian leaned her head on his shoulder. "That's enough, isn't it?" "More than enough." Claire and James moved into town after the wedding, taking Emma with them. The house felt emptier without them, quieter. But it also felt like theirs again, in a way it hadn't for months. One evening, about a week after they'd left, Vivian was going through Clara's old room, cleaning it out, when she found something tucked under the bed. A wooden box, small and plain. Inside were letters. Her letters. The ones she'd written to Silas all those years ago. She carried the box downstairs and found Silas at the table, working on the accounts. "Look what I found," she said, setting the box down. Silas looked up. "What is it?" "Your copies of my letters. I didn't know you kept them." "Of course I kept them. They were all I had of you." Vivian opened the box and pulled out the first letter. The paper was yellowed now, the ink faded. She read the opening lines and felt something twist in her chest. "I sound so formal," she said. "So careful." "You were trying to make a good impression. Was I successful? You got me to write back, didn't you?" She pulled out another letter, then another. Reading them now was like looking at a stranger. The woman who'd written these letters had been hopeful but guarded, practical but desperate. She'd been looking for an escape, a way out of a life that had ground her down to nothing. "Do you ever miss her?" Vivian asked. "The woman who wrote these?" Silas thought about it. "No, I like who you are now better. Even though especially because of what you've been through. It made you who you are, strong, resilient, real." Vivian set the letters down. "I used to think the crash destroyed my life, that everything I was supposed to be died in those mountains. And now? Now I think maybe it just changed what was possible, made me into someone different than I planned to be." She looked at him. "Someone better, I hope." "Much better." They put the letters back in the box and stored it away. And that night, lying in bed, Vivian felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not contentment, exactly, more like acceptance of who she was, of who they were together, of the life they'd built from wreckage and loss. 5 years into their marriage, tragedy struck the valley. A summer storm rolled through with lightning that set the timber ablaze. The fire spread fast, consuming everything in its path. Ranches burned. Livestock died. People lost everything. The Boone Ranch was spared, sitting just outside the fire's path. But their neighbors weren't as lucky. The Hendersons lost their barn and half their cattle. The Pratts lost everything: house, barn, stock, everything. Silas and Vivian didn't hesitate. They opened their land to displaced families, offering pasture for surviving cattle and shelter for people with nowhere else to go. Vivian organized food distribution while Silas coordinated rebuilding efforts. They worked 18-hour days, pushing themselves to exhaustion, trying to help however they could. One night, 2 weeks into the recovery, Silas came in to find Vivian asleep at the table, her head resting on a stack of donation ledgers. He stood there for a moment, looking at her. Her face was thinner than it had been, dark circles under her eyes. Her hands were ink-stained and calloused. She looked exhausted, but she also looked purposeful, like she'd found something worth fighting for. Silas woke her gently. "Come on, you need proper sleep." She blinked up at him, disoriented. "What time is it?" "Past midnight." "I still have to. It'll keep until morning. Come on." He helped her to bed, and she was asleep before her head hit the pillow. Silas lay beside her, watching her breathe, and felt a swell of pride so strong it almost hurt. This was the woman who'd survived a stagecoach crash and 3 weeks in frozen mountains. This was the woman who'd learned to walk again on wooden legs. This was the woman who'd saved his ranch and his life, and now was trying to save everyone else's too. And she was his. The recovery took months, but slowly, with everyone working together, the valley began to heal. Barns were rebuilt. Cattle were restocked. Families found their footing again. And through it all, the Boones were at the center of it, organizing, supporting, leading. People started coming to them for advice, for help, for hope. Silas became someone the other ranchers looked up to. And Vivian became something else entirely. She became a legend. The woman who survived winter. The woman who walked on wooden legs and ran a ranch better than most men. The woman who'd turned tragedy into triumph and now was helping others do the same. People told stories about her, about the blizzard and the crash and the impossible rescue, about how she'd dragged herself through miles of frozen wilderness with nothing but determination and hope, about how she'd married a man she'd never met and built a life that defied every expectation. Some of the stories were true, some were exaggerated, but all of them carried the same message. Vivian Boone was someone worth knowing, someone worth respecting. One afternoon, a reporter from the Denver newspaper showed up at the ranch, asking for an interview. "I've heard remarkable things about you, Mrs. Boone," he said, "about your survival story. I'd like to write about it, if you're willing." Vivian looked at Silas. He shrugged, leaving the decision to her. "What exactly do you want to know?" she asked. The reporter pulled out a notebook. "Everything. How you survived, what it was like, what kept you going." Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right, but I'll tell you the real story. Not the romanticized version people like to tell. That's exactly what I want. She told him everything about the crash, about being trapped in the wreckage with dead bodies, about walking through the blizzard alone, terrified and freezing, about the cabins where she'd sheltered, about Silas finding her more dead than alive, about the amputations and the recovery and the long, brutal process of learning to live again. The reporter wrote it all down, his expression growing more and more awed. "How did you do it?" he asked finally. "How did you keep going when most people would have just given up?" Vivian thought about that. It was a question she'd asked herself 1,000 times. "I don't think it was courage," she said slowly. "I think it was stubbornness. I was too angry to die. Too angry at the unfairness of it all. I'd come all this way to start a new life, and I'd be damned if I was going to let a blizzard take that from me." She paused. "And I had something to live for. Someone waiting for me. Even though I'd never met him, I knew he was out there, and that was enough to keep me moving." The reporter looked at Silas. "And you rode into the mountains to find her. That must have been terrifying." Silas shrugged. "Seemed like the thing to do. Most men would have assumed she was dead. I'm not most men." The article came out 2 weeks later, spread across the front page of the Denver paper. It told their story in vivid detail, from Vivian's survival to Silas's rescue to the life they'd built together. The reporter had captured it perfectly, not as a fairy tale, but as a story of human resilience and stubborn refusal to surrender. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from across the territory. People wanted to know more, wanted to meet them, wanted to hear Vivian speak about survival and recovery. She turned most of them down. But a few, the ones from women who'd lost limbs or suffered trauma or were trying to rebuild their lives after disaster, those she answered. She wrote long, honest letters about the reality of living with disability, about the pain and frustration and moments of despair, but also about the possibility of building something meaningful despite it all. One letter came from a young woman in Kansas who'd lost both arms in a farm accident. She wrote that reading about Vivian had given her hope for the first time since the accident, that knowing someone else had survived the impossible made her think maybe she could too. Vivian showed the letter to Silas, tears streaming down her face. "I never thought—" She stopped, unable to finish. "Never thought what?" "That anything good could come from what happened to me. That it could mean something to someone else." Silas pulled her close. "Everything means something if you let it." 7 years into their marriage, Clara and James had their second child. A boy this time, healthy and loud. They asked Silas and Vivian to be godparents. At the christening, holding the baby while the pastor spoke the words, Vivian felt something settle inside her, a peace she hadn't known she was looking for. This was her family, not the one she'd planned for, not the one she'd dreamed about as a girl in Boston, but the one she'd built from scratch, piece by piece, choice by choice. After the ceremony, Clara pulled her aside. "I wanted to thank you," Clara said, "for everything you've done for us, for giving me a chance when I had nothing." "You don't need to thank me." "Yes, I do. You and Silas, you saved my life, Emma's life, and I'll never forget that." Vivian hugged her, careful of the baby in her arms. "You would have done the same for us." "I hope so." That night, riding home under a sky full of stars, Vivian turned to Silas. "Do you ever wonder what our life would have looked like if things had been different?" "Different how?" "If the coach hadn't crashed, if we'd just met like normal people and gotten married and lived a normal life." Silas thought about it. "Sometimes. Do you?" "Sometimes. But then I think about everything we've been through together, everything we've built, and I realize I wouldn't change it." "Not even the hard parts?" "Especially not the hard parts. They're what made us who we are." Silas smiled. "When did you get so wise?" "I've been spending too much time with you. It's rubbing off." He laughed, and she laughed with him, and they rode home through the darkness, two people who'd found each other in the worst possible way and built something beautiful from the wreckage. 10 years into their marriage, Silas took Vivian back to the mountains, to the cabin where he'd found her, barely alive, all those years ago. It took them most of a day to get there, riding slow because of Vivian's legs. But she insisted on making the trip, said she needed to see it again, needed to face it. The cabin was still standing, though more deteriorated now. The roof had collapsed in one corner and the walls were rotting. But it was recognizable. The same place where Vivian had waited to die and Silas had found her instead. They stood in the doorway together, looking at the empty interior. "I thought it would be bigger," Vivian said quietly. "Memory does that. Makes things seem different than they were. I was so scared, lying here, waiting for you or death, whichever came first. But you didn't give up." "No, I didn't." She turned to look at him. "Why did you really come looking for me, Silas?" The truth this time. He'd answered this question before, but never completely, never with the full truth. He took a breath. "Because I was tired of being alone. Because your letters made me feel like I mattered to someone. And because I couldn't stand the thought of you dying out here thinking no one cared enough to try." He paused. "I came looking for you because I needed to find you. For me as much as for you." Vivian's eyes were bright. "That's the most selfish thing you've ever said. Is it selfish if it saved both our lives?" "No, I suppose not." They stood there for a while longer, remembering. Then Vivian took Silas's hand and led him outside. They walked to the edge of the clearing where you could see down into the valley. The view was spectacular, mountains stretching in every direction, peaks still topped with snow even in summer. "It's beautiful," Vivian said. "It almost killed you." "But it didn't. You wouldn't let it." She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. They stood like that, looking out at the landscape that had tried to destroy them, and failed. "You know what I learned from all this?" Vivian said finally. "What?" "That love isn't about perfection. It's not about finding someone who completes you or makes everything easy. It's about finding someone who sees you at your worst, broken and scared and barely holding on, and chooses to stay anyway." She looked up at him. "You saw me at my absolute worst, and you stayed. You did the same for me." "How?" "You could have left after you recovered. Could have gone back to Boston, or found someone else, someone younger, healthier, easier. But you stayed, even when I was impossible to live with, even when the ranch was failing and the future looked bleak. You stayed, and you fought for us." "Because that's what love is," Vivian said. "It's choosing someone every day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." They rode back to the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. When they got home, Vivian went straight to the extra room, the one they'd built all those years ago and never filled. "I know what this room is for now," she said. "What?" "It's not for children. It's for hope. For the possibility that life can surprise you. That just because something doesn't happen the way you planned doesn't mean it won't happen at all." She smiled. "Maybe we'll fill it someday. Maybe we won't. But either way, it's not empty. It's full of everything we might still become." 15 years into their marriage, the Boone Ranch was the most successful in the valley. They'd expanded to twice the original size, employed 6 full-time hands, and supplied beef to markets as far as Denver and Colorado Springs. Silas had become a respected voice in territorial politics, advising on land use and water rights. And Vivian had become something of a mentor to women across the territory, offering advice and support to those facing their own struggles. But success didn't make them soft. They still worked hard, still fought sometimes, still had days where everything felt impossible. One evening, sitting on the porch after a particularly long day, Vivian turned to Silas. "Do you have any regrets?" "About what?" "About us. About how our life turned out." Silas thought about it, really thought about it. "No," he said finally. "I don't. Not even about that. We built something real, Vivian, something that matters. We helped people, made a difference, created a legacy that'll outlast us both." He took her hand. "That's more than most people get, more than I ever expected." "I used to think the crash ruined my life," Vivian said, "but now I think maybe it gave me a different one. A harder one, but a better one too." "You think things happen for a reason?" "No. I think things just happen, but I think we get to decide what we make of them." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out one by one. The valley was quiet except for the sound of the creek and the distant lowing of cattle. "You know what I'm grateful for?" Silas said. "What?" "That you got on that stagecoach, that you survived the crash, that you were stubborn enough to keep walking, that I was stubborn enough to come looking." He squeezed her hand. "I'm grateful for every single thing that brought you here. even the parts that hurt. Vivian leaned her head on his shoulder. Me too. 20 years after the crash, Vivian Boone stood at the window of her house, looking out at the ranch she'd helped build from ruins. She was 51 years old. Her hair was streaked with gray. Her body ached in ways it hadn't when she was younger. The prosthetics that had once felt foreign were now as much a part of her as her own hands. But she was alive. And more than that, she was happy. Behind her, Silas came into the room. He was older too, his hair mostly gray, his face lined with years of sun and work. But his eyes were still the same, steady and solid, the eyes of a man who'd never once broken a promise. "You coming to bed?" he asked. "In a minute." He crossed the room and stood beside her, looking out at the same view she was watching. The ranch spread before them, peaceful in the moonlight. "You know what I was thinking?" Vivian said. "What's that?" "That if someone had told me 20 years ago that I'd be standing here, in Colorado, married to you, running a successful ranch on wooden legs, I would have thought they were crazy. And now? Now I can't imagine any other life." Silas put his arm around her. "Neither can I." They stood there together, two people who'd been broken and put themselves back together, who'd survived the impossible and built something lasting from the pieces. And Vivian realized that was the real miracle. Not the survival, not the rescue, not even the love, though that was part of it. The miracle was the choice. The choice to keep going when giving up would have been easier. The choice to trust when trust felt impossible. The choice to build when destruction seemed inevitable. They'd chosen each other, day after day, year after year, through every hardship and triumph. And that choice, that stubborn, relentless, beautifully human choice, had created something stronger than either of them could have built alone. "Come on," Silas said, taking her hand. "Let's go to bed." Vivian followed him, leaving the window and the view behind. Tomorrow there would be work to do, problems to solve, challenges to face. But tonight, she had everything she needed. A warm house, a good man, a life built on her own terms. And that was enough. More than enough. As they climbed into bed, Vivian thought about the young woman who'd boarded that stagecoach 20 years ago, full of hope and fear and desperate longing for something better. She thought about the weeks in the mountains, the pain, the loss, the moments when death felt closer than the next breath. And she thought about what she'd tell that younger version of herself, if she could. Keep going. No matter how hard it gets, keep going. Because on the other side of all that pain and fear is a life you can't even imagine yet. A life that's messy and difficult and absolutely worth fighting for. Love isn't about being saved by someone. It's about two broken people choosing to save each other. Strength isn't about being perfect. It's about getting back up every time you fall. And home isn't a place you're born into. It's a place you build piece by piece with someone who refuses to give up on you even when you've given up on yourself. Silas's breathing evened out beside her, deep and steady. Vivian closed her eyes, her hand resting on his chest, feeling his heartbeat under her palm. And she slept, dreamless and content, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, they'd face it together, the way they always had, the way they always would.